The billionaire Mr. Radin was known in the city as a man with endless money and strong power. And people often feared him more than they respected him, because he enjoyed showing that he was above everyone else. And he believed that money decided a person's value, so when he walked into a room, people became careful with their words and forced their smiles. And among all the people who worked for him, his driver Adam was the quietest and the poorest, a man who spoke little, dressed simply, and always kept his eyes low, doing his job with calm respect, never asking for more and never complaining. And this silence made others ignore him easily, which Mr. Radin secretly enjoyed, because it reminded him of his own power. And one afternoon, during a private meeting at his large office, where rich friends gathered to plan a grand party, the kind filled with lights, music, and famous faces, the talk slowly turned into jokes and laughter about status and class. And someone laughed about how different their lives were from ordinary people. And that was when Mr. Radin leaned back in his chair with a proud smile and said in a joking tone that carried quiet cruelty, "Why don't we invite my driver too? Let's see how he behaves among real people." And the room filled with loud laughter. Glasses clinked and faces lit up with amusement, because to them it sounded like harmless fun, a small joke that would make the night more entertaining. And no one thought about how the driver might feel, or what it meant to be laughed at without being present to defend himself. And later that evening, when Adam finished his long day of work and was about to leave, a shiny golden envelope was handed to him by a staff member, heavy and formal, with his name written clearly on it. And for a moment he thought it must be a mistake, because invitations like this were meant for rich guests, not for drivers. But when he opened it and read the words carefully, his hands became still and his heart tightened slightly, because it was a real invitation to the billionaire's grand party, the kind people talked about for weeks. And Adam stood there quietly, feeling a strange mix of surprise and discomfort as questions slowly filled his mind, wondering why Mr. Radin would invite him to such a place, wondering if it was some kind of test or joke. And as he walked home that evening, the city lights felt heavier than usual, and the noise around him faded into his thoughts, because something about the invitation did not feel kind. It felt planned. And Adam had lived long enough to sense when respect was missing. Yet he also felt a calm voice inside him telling him not to refuse, telling him that this moment, strange as it seemed, had meaning, and that sometimes life places people in uncomfortable rooms for reasons that are not clear at first. And while he walked, memories quietly moved through his mind, memories of choices he once made, roads he once walked, and truths he kept hidden, things no one around him knew. And he reached his small room, sat on his bed, and placed the golden envelope beside him, staring at it for a long time as if it could speak. And outside the window, the city continued its fast rhythm, unaware of the quiet storm forming in his thoughts, because Adam was not afraid of rich people or fancy halls. He was afraid of being misunderstood, of being turned into a joke for the happiness of others. And yet he decided to go, not because he wanted to prove anything, but because something inside him whispered that this invitation, meant to humiliate him, might reveal more than Mr. Radin ever expected. And while the billionaire enjoyed his evening, confident and amused by his own idea, imagining the laughter that would come when the poor driver walked into a room full of wealth and pride, he did not know that the simple man he mocked carried a calm strength built from years of silence, loss, and learning, and that sometimes the quietest people hold the deepest stories. And sometimes the joke meant to lower someone becomes the first step toward an unexpected truth. And as the night grew darker, both men prepared in their own ways, one planning entertainment, the other preparing his heart. And somewhere between pride and patience, between power and humility, a moment was forming that would soon change how everyone in that grand hall would see respect, value, and human worth, because the invitation was not just paper anymore. It was a door, and once opened, nothing would remain the same. Adam did not sleep much that night, because the golden invitation rested on the small table beside his bed, like a quiet question that refused to leave his mind. And as the hours passed, memories he had kept buried for years began to rise slowly, not loudly, but gently, like shadows returning at sunset. And he remembered a time when his hands were not rough from driving and cleaning, when his back was straight with confidence and his voice was heard in rooms filled with serious discussion. Because long ago, before life turned simple and silent, Adam had lived a very different life, one full of responsibility, sharp decisions, and heavy trust. But no one in the city knew this now, because he had chosen to step away from that world after a painful betrayal that broke more than just his career. And since then, he had learned to live quietly, finding peace in routine and honesty. And as he lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, he asked himself why this invitation bothered him so much, because he had faced worse days before. Days with no money and no support, yet this felt different. Because this time, the danger was not hunger or struggle, but humiliation, the kind that touches pride and dignity. And Adam did not fear being poor, but he feared being turned into a joke in front of people who believed money made them superior. And still, a calm voice inside him whispered that running away would only confirm what they believed. And that sometimes silence was strength, but sometimes presence was stronger. And the next morning he woke early as usual, washed his face, and prepared for work with the same quiet discipline. And when he arrived at the garage, the other workers looked at him differently, because rumors had already begun to spread. And some whispered that the boss had invited Adam to the party as a joke. Others said it was a test, and a few simply laughed. But Adam did not respond. He only nodded politely and began his duties, driving Mr. Radin through the busy streets as always, listening to business calls filled with numbers and pride, while the billionaire spoke loudly about the upcoming event, making sure everyone around heard how grand it would be. And more than once he mentioned the invitation again with a playful smile, clearly enjoying the idea. And Adam caught his reflection in the mirror, seeing the confidence in his employer's eyes, the kind that comes from never being questioned. And for a moment, Adam wondered if Mr. Radin had ever felt small in his life, or if he had ever known what it was like to lose everything. And as the car stopped at a red light, Adam's thoughts drifted to the past again, to the years when he had once worn clean suits and carried responsibility that affected many lives, when people waited for his approval and respected his decisions, and how quickly that world had changed when trust was broken and names were erased. And he chose to disappear rather than fight, because he was tired, not weak, just tired of noise and false loyalty. And driving became a way to stay invisible, a way to observe life without being pulled into its games. And over time he had learned that dignity could exist even in silence, and that respect did not always need a title. Yet now, with this invitation, the past was knocking again, asking to be seen. And when Adam returned home that evening, he opened his old wooden box hidden under his bed, a box he rarely touched, and inside were a few papers, old cards, and memories that carried weight, and he held them briefly before placing them back, not with fear, but with calm acceptance, as if reminding himself that those days were real, even if forgotten by others. And then he began to think carefully about the party, about how he should go, what he should wear, how he should speak, not to impress anyone, but to remain true to himself, because he understood something important, that people who try to humiliate others often do so to hide their own emptiness, and that reacting with anger would only give them power, while calm presence could quietly take it away. And the next day, when he went to work again, the teasing became more open. Small comments from staff, soft laughs when he passed by, and looks filled with curiosity. But Adam stayed gentle and respectful, and this confused some people, because they expected him to look nervous or upset, and instead he looked thoughtful, as if preparing for something meaningful. And during a short break, a young cleaner asked him quietly if he was really going to the party. And Adam smiled lightly and said yes, and the boy asked why. And Adam replied in a low voice that sometimes life gives you moments not to fight, but to face, and the boy did not fully understand, but he felt something honest in those words. And as the day of the party came closer, the excitement among the rich guests grew. Dresses were chosen, suits were prepared, and the event was talked about like a show. And in their conversations, Adam's name came up again and again, often followed by laughter, and yet none of them truly knew him. None knew the quiet strength behind his calm eyes, or the reason he never spoke of his past. And on the evening before the event, Adam sat alone once more, holding the invitation, reading it slowly. And instead of fear, he felt clarity, because he understood that this was not just about being invited or mocked. It was about standing firm in who he was, no matter how others tried to define him. And he promised himself that he would walk into that hall with respect for everyone, even those who did not respect him, because his peace did not depend on their approval. And far away, in his large house filled with lights and laughter, Mr. Radin talked proudly about the next night, imagining the reactions, imagining the amusement, completely unaware that his simple joke had already set something much deeper in motion, something he could not control, because while he planned entertainment, Adam was preparing truth, and while one expected laughter, the other carried quiet certainty. And as the night slowly passed and the city slept, two very different men moved toward the same moment from opposite sides of life, one driven by pride, the other by calm resolve. And the space between them was filled with tension, waiting to break, because the party would not just be a gathering of rich people. It would become a place where masks began to fall, and where the meaning of respect would be tested. And the invitation that was meant to humiliate was slowly turning into a key, opening a door that had been closed for years, leading toward a truth no one was ready to face yet. The day of the party finally arrived, and from early morning the city seemed to move with extra energy, as if it already knew something important was about to happen. And inside his small room, Adam woke before sunrise, sitting quietly on the edge of his bed, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and life beginning again. And for a moment, he closed his eyes and breathed slowly, not in fear, but in focus, because today was not just another working day. It was a day that carried weight, meaning, and unseen tension, and he wanted to meet it with a calm heart. So he washed his face, prepared his simple breakfast, and dressed carefully, choosing clean, neat clothes that were modest but respectful. Not trying to look rich, not trying to look poor, only trying to look like himself. And when he looked in the mirror, he did not see a driver or a guest. He saw a man who had lived, lost, learned, and survived. And that gave him quiet strength. And as the hours passed, the city grew louder, cars filled the roads, and excitement slowly built around the grand evening event. While at the same time, in a large, luxurious house across the city, Mr. Radin stood before a mirror as helpers moved around him, fixing his suit and adjusting details. And he looked pleased, confident, and amused, because in his mind the party was already a success, and the idea of his driver showing up among powerful people still made him smile, not because he hated Adam, but because he enjoyed feeling above others. And to him, this was harmless fun, a way to entertain his guests and remind them of his position. And as he walked through his house giving orders, he spoke loudly about the guest list, making sure Adam's name was mentioned more than once, enjoying the reactions he received, while the staff nodded politely even if some felt uncomfortable inside, because they understood how cruel laughter could be when aimed at someone who could not defend himself. And as evening came closer, lights were turned on, decorations were placed, and soft music began to fill the air, turning the mansion into a shining place of beauty and pride. And outside, expensive cars started arriving one by one, carrying guests dressed in elegant clothes, their voices full of excitement and curiosity. And among their conversations, one topic returned again and again: the strange invitation given to the billionaire's driver. And some laughed openly, others smiled with interest, and a few wondered quietly if there was more to the story. But no one expected anything serious, because in their world, people like Adam were not meant to surprise anyone. And then, just as the sun disappeared behind the buildings and the sky darkened, Adam arrived at the gate, not in a luxury car, but in a simple taxi. And when he stepped out, the guard looked at him with confusion, checking the invitation twice before letting him in. And Adam thanked him politely, walking forward with slow, steady steps, feeling many eyes turn toward him as soon as he entered the bright entrance. And the moment he crossed the door, the sound of laughter and music seemed to pause for just a second, as if the room itself noticed his presence, and whispers began to move from one group to another. Soft at first, then clearer, and faces turned with mixed expressions: curiosity, surprise, and hidden amusement. And Adam felt all of it: the looks, the judgment, the silent questions. But he kept his posture calm, his face relaxed, and his gaze steady, because he had already accepted that this moment would not be easy, and he was prepared to face it without anger. And across the room, Mr. Radin noticed him almost immediately, his lips curling into a smile of satisfaction, because the scene looked exactly as he had imagined. And he raised his glass slightly, enjoying the attention, before speaking loudly enough for people nearby to hear, making a playful comment about how even his driver had decided to join high society tonight. And laughter followed, light and careless. And Adam heard it clearly, but instead of reacting, he simply nodded politely and walked a little further inside, choosing a quiet place to stand, not hiding, but not seeking attention either. And this confused some guests, because they expected him to look nervous or embarrassed. Yet he looked calm, almost thoughtful, as if he were observing rather than being observed. And a few people began to study him more closely, noticing his posture, the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that did not match the role they had assigned to him. And whispers changed tones slightly, becoming curious instead of mocking. And a waiter passing by suddenly slowed down when he saw Adam's face, his eyes widening in confusion, as if trying to remember something important. And he stopped for a second, staring, then shook his head as if unsure, and walked away quickly, leaving behind a strange moment that went unnoticed by most, but not by Adam, who caught the look and felt a small shift inside his chest, because he recognized that look. The look of someone seeing a memory they could not fully place. And as the evening continued, conversations grew louder, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the air. Yet beneath the surface, tension slowly grew, because Adam's calm presence did not fade, and his silence began to feel heavy, meaningful. And a few guests started to wonder why he did not seem impressed or afraid. And Mr. Radin, noticing this change, decided to push the situation further, walking toward Adam with a confident smile and speaking loudly enough to draw attention, asking him if he was enjoying the party and if everything was not too much for him. And people nearby paused to listen, expecting an awkward moment, but Adam answered politely, saying that the party was beautiful and that he was grateful for the invitation, his voice steady and respectful. And this simple reply did something unexpected. It removed the humor from the moment, because there was no shame in his tone. No anger, no fear, only calm honesty. And the laughter that Mr. Radin expected did not come as strongly as before, replaced instead by an uneasy silence. And some guests exchanged looks, unsure of how to react, because the situation was no longer clearly funny, and Mr. Radin laughed again, a bit louder this time, trying to regain control, making another light joke, but even he felt something shift, something he could not name, because the driver he thought he knew was not behaving like a man meant to be mocked. And as Adam stepped slightly aside, giving space, the room slowly returned to its noise, but the mood had changed, and whispers now carried curiosity instead of pure amusement. And in one corner, a senior guest watched Adam closely, his face serious, his eyes narrowing as if trying to remember a face from long ago. And he whispered to the person beside him that something about the driver felt familiar. And the other nodded, also sensing something strange. And the night continued with music and talk. But beneath it all, an invisible thread of tension grew tighter, because Adam's presence had planted a question in the room, a question no one could yet answer. And while many still saw him as a joke, a few began to wonder if they had judged too quickly. And Adam stood quietly among them, patient and observant, knowing that the real moment had not yet arrived, that this was only the surface, the beginning of a deeper reveal. And as he looked around the shining hall filled with wealth and pride, he understood that the hardest part was not entering this world, but watching how easily people forgot kindness when surrounded by power. And somewhere within him, a quiet resolve strengthened, because he knew that, before the night ended, the truth would find its way out, not through anger or revenge, but through calm truth. And the party that began as a joke was slowly turning into something far more serious, something that would soon make everyone question what they believed about status, worth, and the man they had laughed at. And as the music played on and lights shimmered above, the first real crack appeared in the mask of pride, unseen but growing, ready to break open at the right moment. As the night moved deeper, the party grew louder and brighter, yet the feeling in the room slowly changed, becoming heavier in a way that was hard to explain, because even though music played and laughter continued, many eyes kept drifting back to Adam, who stood calmly near the side, holding a glass of water he had not touched, watching the room with quiet attention. And it was strange how someone doing nothing at all could draw so much focus. But his calm did not match the role people had already decided for him, and that difference made them uneasy. And across the hall, Mr. Radin noticed this shift as well, and though he tried to ignore it, a small irritation began to grow inside him, because the attention was supposed to stay on him, on his success, his power, his grand event, not on the silent driver who was meant to be a joke. And so he decided to take control again, to turn the moment back into entertainment. And with a confident smile, he raised his voice and called Adam over, making sure several guests were close enough to hear. And when Adam walked toward him, polite and steady, the room slowly quieted again, because people sensed something was about to happen. And Mr. Radin, still smiling, asked him simple questions in a tone that sounded friendly but carried hidden mockery, asking if he was enjoying himself, if the food was too rich, if the place felt too fancy. And each question drew light laughter from the crowd. But Adam answered each one calmly and respectfully, saying that he appreciated the invitation and that everything was well prepared. And his answers were so balanced and sincere that they slowly took the sharp edge away from the jokes. And some guests began to shift uncomfortably, because the expected embarrassment never came. And instead of looking small, Adam looked composed. And this made Mr. Radin feel slightly exposed, though he did not yet understand why. And trying again, he made another comment, this time louder, saying that it must be a rare experience for a driver to stand among such successful people, And again laughter followed, but weaker than before, because something in Adam's calm eyes made the joke feel less funny. And Adam paused for a moment before replying, not to challenge, but to choose his words carefully. And then he said softly that every place had something to teach, and every person had a story worth hearing, and that learning did not depend on where one stood, but on how one listened. And his words were simple, but they landed with unexpected weight. And for a brief moment, silence spread across the group, as if people were unsure how to respond. And in that quiet space, a strange thing happened. A man standing near the back of the room, older and well-dressed, stared at Adam with growing intensity, his face slowly changing from curiosity to confusion, and then to something like recognition. And he leaned forward slightly, as if trying to see more clearly, and whispered to the woman beside him that the driver looked familiar, though he could not place where from, and the woman shrugged. But the man did not look convinced, and his attention stayed fixed on Adam, and at the same time, a waiter passing by slowed his steps again when he saw Adam's face, his hands trembling slightly as he nearly dropped a tray, and he quickly turned away, his expression troubled, as if he had seen a ghost or a memory he was not ready to face. And Adam noticed these reactions, not with pride, but with quiet understanding, because he knew recognition often came in pieces, slowly, when the past tried to return. And he felt the weight of old days pressing closer, and yet he stayed calm, reminding himself why he had chosen silence for so long. And while this quiet tension built, Mr. Radin felt the energy of the room slipping from his control, and he laughed again, a little louder, a little sharper, trying to pull attention back to himself, and suggested that Adam should tell everyone a story from his life as a driver, something funny or embarrassing. And several guests looked at Adam with interest, expecting him to refuse or stumble, and this moment felt heavier than the others, because now the spotlight was fully on him, and Adam could feel the old familiar pressure, the kind that once came with boardrooms and big decisions. And he took a slow breath, letting the noise fade in his mind. And then he spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard, saying that every job teaches something, and that driving had taught him patience, observation, and how to understand people without judging them. And he added that sometimes the most important lessons come when you sit quietly and listen instead of speaking. And his voice carried a calm confidence that did not ask for approval. And as he spoke, the room grew quieter again, not because he demanded attention, but because people were drawn to the honesty in his tone. And even Mr. Radin hesitated, unsure how to turn this into a joke anymore. And for the first time that night, he felt a small discomfort, because the man he thought he controlled was not playing the role he expected. And around them, guests exchanged looks, sensing that something deeper was unfolding, something beyond simple humor or class difference. And the older man in the back suddenly took a step forward, his eyes wide now, as if a memory had finally clicked into place. And he whispered a name under his breath, a name that carried weight, though no one else heard it clearly. And Adam noticed the movement, his gaze meeting the man's for just a second. And in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, a recognition that needed no words, and Adam's heart tightened slightly, because he knew this was the beginning of the truth trying to surface. And he had hoped it would wait a little longer. But life rarely followed careful plans, and the room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to be said. And even the music felt softer now, fading into the background, and Mr. Radin, sensing the strange shift, cleared his throat and tried to laugh again. But his laughter sounded forced, and he quickly suggested everyone enjoy the food and drinks, hoping to break the tension, and people slowly moved. But their eyes kept returning to Adam and to the older guest who continued to stare at him, and whispers began again. Different from before, quieter, more serious. filled with curiosity rather than mockery, and Adam stepped slightly aside, giving himself space, his heart steady but alert, because he knew that the wall he had built around his past was starting to crack. And once it did, there would be no turning back. And as he stood there, listening to fragments of conversation and feeling the weight of attention, he understood that this moment was no longer about humiliation. It was about recognition, and recognition could change everything. For better or worse, and somewhere deep inside, he accepted that the truth he had hidden for so long was beginning to rise, slowly but surely. And the party that had started as a joke was now turning into a stage where hidden histories were about to meet the present, and where pride, power, and silence would soon be tested in ways no one had expected. And as the light shimmered above and the music played softly in the background, the tension thickened like a held breath, waiting for the next moment. The moment when someone would finally speak the name that lingered unspoken in the air and change the night forever. The room felt different now, heavier and quieter, as if an invisible line had been crossed, and even though music still played softly in the background, it no longer covered the tension that had settled between the guests, because something unspoken was moving through the air, something close to recognition, and Adam could feel it clearly. The way people looked at him had changed, no longer full of easy laughter, but filled with questions. And among all those faces, one stood out the most. The older man who kept staring at him with growing certainty, his hands slightly shaking as memories tried to arrange themselves in his mind. And finally, unable to hold it in any longer, the man took a slow step forward, his voice low but firm as he spoke Adam's name. Not the name people at the party knew him by, but another name, one that had not been spoken aloud in many years. And the sound of it cut through the room like a quiet bell, causing nearby guests to turn their heads in confusion, because they had never heard that name before. And Adam felt his chest tighten for a brief moment, not with fear, but with acceptance, because he knew this moment would come sooner or later. And he slowly lifted his eyes to meet the man's gaze. And in that silent exchange, years of memory passed between them. Shared history, old meetings, long discussions, and difficult choices. And the man swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke again, asking if it was really him, if he was truly standing there after all these years. And Adam did not answer right away, because he knew that one word could change everything. And the room seemed to hold its breath, as guests leaned closer, curiosity burning in their eyes, sensing that they were standing at the edge of something important. And finally Adam nodded gently, not proudly, not sadly, just honestly. And that small movement sent a quiet shock through the group around them, because the older man's face changed completely, his expression turning from doubt to certainty, and then to deep respect, and he spoke again, louder this time, his voice filled with emotion as he said that he never thought he would see him again, that he believed he had disappeared forever. And whispers began to spread quickly, names and guesses passing from one person to another, growing louder with every second. And Mr. Radin, who had been watching from a short distance, frowned slightly, sensing that something important was slipping beyond his control. And he stepped closer, asking what was going on, his tone sharp but uncertain, and the older man turned toward him, surprise and disbelief in his eyes, asking if he truly did not know who his driver was. And this question caused a strange pause, because suddenly the roles in the room felt reversed. And Mr. Radin laughed lightly, trying to brush it off, saying that his driver was just a driver, nothing more. And the older man shook his head slowly, almost sadly, and said that the man standing before them was once one of the sharpest minds he had ever worked with, someone whose ideas helped shape companies and guide leaders, someone whose name once opened doors everywhere. And a wave of confusion spread across the room, guests exchanging looks, trying to connect this calm driver with the powerful figure being described. And Adam closed his eyes briefly, as if asking for patience, because he had never wanted this story to come out like this. Not in a room full of strangers, not in a moment charged with pride and judgment. And when he opened his eyes again, he spoke softly, asking the man to stop, saying that the past was the past and that he had chosen a different life. But the older man shook his head, emotion clear in his voice, saying that some truths should not be buried, especially when someone is being laughed at for something they are not. And the silence that followed felt heavy and serious, pressing down on everyone present. And even those who had laughed earlier now stood still, uneasy, realizing they might have judged too quickly. And Mr. Radin's smile faded as he looked from one face to another, trying to understand what was happening. And he asked again, more sharply this time, what all this meant. And the older man took a deep breath before speaking clearly, telling the room that years ago, Adam had been a respected leader in the business world, known for his intelligence, fairness, and vision. Someone who had helped build projects that later made many people wealthy, and that his sudden disappearance had shocked many, because he had walked away without explanation. And as the man spoke, murmurs spread, some guests nodding slowly as memories returned, others looking shocked as pieces began to fit together. And Adam stood quietly, his hands relaxed at his sides, not denying the words, but not proudly accepting them either. And when the older man mentioned betrayal, the room fell silent again, because betrayal carried weight, and people leaned in, wanting to hear more. And Adam finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, asking him to stop there, saying that he had made his peace with the past, and that he did not come tonight to reopen old wounds. And his tone was gentle, not defensive, and this made the moment even more powerful, because it showed control and humility, not anger. And the guests began to see him differently, not as a poor driver, but as someone who had chosen a quieter path. And Mr. Radin felt a strange tightening in his chest, because the story unfolding in front of him was not one he could laugh at. And for the first time that evening, he felt unsure, because the man he had invited to mock was now standing at the center of the room, commanding attention without raising his voice. And the laughter that once filled the hall felt distant and misplaced. And some guests lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with their earlier reactions. And the older man continued softly, saying that Adam had walked away after being betrayed by people he trusted, choosing dignity over conflict, peace over power, and silence over revenge. And that many had searched for him, but he had chosen to live simply, far from the world that once praised him. And as these words settled, the room changed again, the air thick with reflection, and Adam looked around slowly, meeting the eyes of the guests. And in that moment, they did not see a servant or a joke, but a man with a deep story, a man who had carried loss with grace. And Mr. Radin felt his confidence slipping, because he realized he had judged without knowing, laughed without understanding, and used his power carelessly. And though he did not yet speak, his expression showed the beginning of discomfort, and Adam, sensing the shift, finally spoke again, his voice steady and kind, saying that he never meant to hide or deceive anyone, that he simply chose a quieter life after learning how fragile success could be, and that driving was honest work that allowed him to live without fear or pride. And his words carried no bitterness, only truth, and this made them even more powerful, because they were not spoken to impress or shame, but to explain. And a deep silence followed, one filled not with tension now, but with reflection, as guests processed what they had heard, and many felt a quiet sense of regret for their earlier laughter. And the older man nodded slowly, his eyes moist, clearly moved. And he said that some people lose their way when they gain power, but others find wisdom when they let it go. and his words hung in the air like a lesson meant for everyone. And Mr. Radin stood still, his thoughts racing, because the joke he had planned had turned into a mirror, reflecting something uncomfortable back at him. And for the first time that night, he looked at Adam not as a driver, not as a joke, but as a man with a past, a choice, and a strength he had never considered. And the party that had started with laughter and pride now stood at a turning point, where respect began to replace mockery and curiosity replaced judgment. And although no one yet knew what would happen next, one thing was clear: the truth had entered the room, and it would not leave quietly, because once spoken, it demanded to be understood. And the night was far from over, and the deepest change was still waiting to unfold. The room stayed silent for several long seconds after the truth settled into everyone's mind. And in that silence, people began to feel the weight of their own thoughts. Because what started as entertainment had turned into something uncomfortable and real. And many guests avoided looking at Adam's face, ashamed of how easily they had laughed before, while others looked at him with new respect, trying to understand how a man with such a past could stand so calmly among them. And Mr. Radin felt his throat tighten, because the confidence he had carried all evening was slowly slipping away, replaced by confusion and unease. And he cleared his throat as if to speak, but no words came at first, because for the first time he was unsure of his place in the moment. And Adam, noticing the tension, gently broke the silence by speaking again. Not loudly, not emotionally, but with steady calm, saying that he never wanted attention or praise, and that his life as a driver was not a punishment but a choice, because after losing trust in people he once depended on, he chose a quieter path where he could live honestly and observe the world without being pulled into its games. And his words carried a softness that made people listen closely, because they were not spoken to impress, but to explain. And as he spoke, some guests slowly nodded, beginning to understand that success and dignity were not always the same thing. And the older man who had recognized him earlier looked at Adam with deep respect, saying that many had searched for him, hoping to learn from him again, and that his disappearance had left questions that were never answered. And Adam replied gently that sometimes answers come only when silence has done its work. And this made the room even quieter, as people reflected on their own lives, their own choices, and the masks they wore. And Mr. Radin shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable now, because the focus had completely changed, and the joke he had planned had turned into a lesson directed at him without a single harsh word being spoken. And he finally spoke, his voice lower than before, asking Adam why he had never said anything, why he had accepted being treated like someone lesser. And Adam looked at him calmly and said that dignity does not come from correcting every wrong idea others have, but from knowing who you are even when others do not. And this answer struck deeply, because it carried no anger, only truth, and a quiet sense of peace. And some guests lowered their heads slightly, realizing how easily they judged people by roles and titles, and how quickly they laughed when they believed someone had less power. And the room now felt different, slower, more thoughtful, and the soft music in the background seemed almost out of place. And Mr. Radin felt something heavy in his chest, something like regret, because he began to see his own behavior clearly, how he had used his position to feel superior, how he had turned a person into a joke without thinking about the harm. And for the first time that night, he spoke without pride, asking Adam if he felt insulted. And Adam paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. And he said that he did not feel insulted, but he did feel sad, because mockery often comes from insecurity, and because kindness is usually forgotten when power speaks too loudly. And his voice was not accusing, only honest. And that honesty made the moment heavier than anger ever could. And Mr. Radin lowered his eyes slightly, realizing that the man standing before him had more self-control and wisdom than he had expected, and perhaps more than he himself possessed, and the guests watched closely, sensing that something important was happening, something rare, where pride and humility stood face to face. And the older man spoke again, addressing the room, saying that true success was not measured by money or status, but by how one treated others when no reward was expected. And his words seemed to settle into the hearts of those listening, and a few people nodded slowly, thoughtful and quiet. And Adam stood calmly, his hands relaxed, his expression gentle, and in that moment he looked less like a driver and more like a teacher, though he never claimed to be one. And Mr. Radin took a deep breath, clearly struggling with his emotions, and then, in a voice that surprised even himself, he apologized, not loudly, not dramatically, but sincerely, saying that he had invited Adam with the wrong intention, that he had wanted to amuse himself and others, and that he now saw how wrong that was, and the room fell silent again, because apologies were rare in places built on pride. And hearing one felt unexpected and powerful. And Adam listened quietly, then nodded once, accepting the words without celebration, because for him, forgiveness was not about winning, but about letting go, and he said that everyone makes mistakes, and what matters is what one learns from them. And this simple response seemed to ease the tension in the room, like air returning after a long pause. And some guests exhaled softly, feeling relief, and the atmosphere began to soften, the sharp edges smoothing into something more human. And Mr. Radin straightened his posture, looking around the room, and spoke again, this time addressing everyone, admitting that he had allowed pride to guide his actions too often, and that tonight had reminded him that respect should never depend on wealth or position. And his voice, though still strong, carried humility now. And this change did not go unnoticed, because people leaned in, listening with genuine attention, and Adam watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with understanding, because he knew how hard it was to admit fault in front of others. And as the tension eased, conversation slowly returned, but it was different now, softer, more thoughtful. And people spoke in lower tones, as if afraid to break the fragile honesty that had settled over the room. And some guests approached Adam gently, asking polite questions, not out of curiosity alone, but with respect, and he answered briefly, kindly, never boasting, always redirecting attention away from himself. And this only increased their respect, because humility often speaks louder than pride. And Mr. Radin observed this quietly, reflecting on how easily he had misjudged someone who carried such depth behind silence. And he began to understand that leadership was not about being above others, but about seeing them clearly. And the party, once planned as a display of power, had turned into a lesson in character. And as time passed, laughter slowly returned, but it was softer and more genuine, free from mockery. And people spoke more thoughtfully, aware that words carried weight. And Adam remained calm and grounded, never seeking attention, yet naturally drawing it through his quiet presence. And the older man who had recognized him earlier stood nearby, smiling gently, as if relieved that the truth had finally found its place. And as the night continued, it became clear that something important had changed. Not just in how Adam was seen, but in how many people saw themselves. And although no grand announcement was made, and no dramatic gesture followed, the shift was real, deep and lasting, and Mr. Radin, standing among his guests, felt a strange mix of humility and gratitude, realizing that the greatest lesson of the night had not come from wealth or power, but from a man he had once seen as invisible. And as the evening slowly moved forward, one truth remained clear to everyone in the room. That respect could not be bought, status could not define worth, And the quiet strength of character could outshine even the brightest display of riches. And though the night was not yet over, its meaning had already been sealed, because the man invited to be mocked had instead reminded them all what it meant to be human.